What follows is a summary of research on the human embryo, which indicates that sense organs develop much earlier than one might have supposed. The research strengthens the likelihood that when the embryo feels two or more sensations at the same time, the experience causes it to imagine a holding place, a premonition of the inner space where mental activity occurs, to capture and preserve the simultaneity which it enlists in its drive toward unity. With cellular multiplication occurring in every direction at the same time, the embryo's unity is at risk. The embryo requires an integrating counter force to ensure its unity. This temporal inner space, triggered into being by the simultaneity of felt sensations, shores up that unity. And because the more rapid the flux of sensations, the more unchanging and timeless their simultaneity, once simultaneity establishes itself as inner space, sensations which occur at any time are experienced as transpiring in the same ongoing now of inner space. This ongoing now marks the beginning of self-identity, and the primary function of this ongoing now is to serve as a unifying force, an invisible nucleus around which the organism expands and diversifies. Much of the following is taken from The Fetal Senses, a classical view, birth psychology on the web. From it, I learned that, quote, the maternal womb is an optimal, stimulating, interactive environment for human development. Activity never ceases, and a fetus is never isolated. Touch, the first sense, is the cornerstone of human experience and communication, beginning in the womb. Montague, 1978. Quote continues. Just before 8 weeks gestational age, the first sensitivity to touch manifests in a set of protective movements to avoid a mere hair stroke on the cheek. Skin sensitivity quickly extends to the genital area, 10 weeks, palms, 11 weeks, soles, 12 weeks. By 17 weeks, all parts of the abdomen and buttocks are sensitive. Skin is marvelously complex, containing 100 varieties of cells, which seem especially sensitive to heat, cold, pressure, and pain. By 32 weeks, nearly every part of the body is sensitive to the same light stroke of a single hair. Unquote. Immersed in amniotic fluid, the embryo experiences simultaneously at every location on the skin the sensation caused by the pressure of liquid surrounding it. My contention is that the sensations felt at the same time arising from different areas of the skin translate as a simultaneity, which is the opening act of the mind. As the embryo evolves and other senses beside the tactile become available to it, the simultaneity of sensations, differing in kind, hearing, smelling, tasting, and even seeing, will reinforce the sense of unity which begins physiologically but finally translates psychologically in the creation of the person. To continue the quote from Classical View Birth Psychology. The first dramatic motion, one that has come to symbolize life itself, is the first heartbeat at about 3 weeks after conception. This rhythmic activity continues while valves, chambers, and all other parts and connections are under construction, illustrating an important fact about development. Parts are pressed into service as they become available. Furthermore, use is necessary for development, unquote, in the fetal senses. Thereafter, no sensation is felt that is not accompanied by the heartbeat, an ongoing simultaneity which contributes significantly to the continuity of the impression of unity. As one sees from the sound scan of the embryo at 3 weeks, the heartbeat reverberates through the entire organism, which assembles its developing parts to the steady beat of a drum. Back to the quotation. Between weeks 6 and 10, fetal bodies burst into motion, achieving graceful stretching and rotational movements of the head, arms, and legs. Hand to head, hand to face, hand to mouth movements, mouth opening, closing, and swallowing are all present at 10 weeks. Tajani and Ina Roberto, 1990. By 14 weeks, the complete repertoire of fetal movements seen throughout gestation are already in evidence. De Vries, Visser, Preachittle, 1985. Movement is spontaneous, endogenous, caused by factors within the organism, and typically cycles between activity and rest. Breathing movements and jaw movements have begun. Hands are busy interacting with other parts of the body and with the umbilical cord, unquote, from the fetal senses. It's so obvious that whatever parts of the fetal body the hand touches, the tactile sensations on hand and the part felt are felt simultaneously, that it's easy to overlook the fact that the repeated simultaneity of self-referring sensations prefigures and provides the impetus for creating an imaginary simultaneity called self. Quote back to the fetal senses. The vestibular system, that is, vestibules or cavities leading to other cavities, designed to register head and body motion as well as the pull of gravity, begins developing at about 8 weeks. This requires construction of 6 semicircular canals, fluid-filled structures in the ears, which help maintain balance. The author continues. Although a concentric series of barriers buffer the fetus from the outside world, amniotic fluid, embryonic membranes, uterus, and the maternal abdomen, the fetus lives in a stimulating matrix of sound, vibration, and motion. Many studies now confirm that voices reach the womb rather than being overwhelmed by the background noise created by the mother and placenta. Researchers in Belfast have demonstrated that reactive listening begins at 16 weeks gestational age, 2 months sooner than other types of measurements indicated. These findings indicate the complexity of hearing, lending support to the idea that receptive hearing begins with the skin and skeletal framework, skin being a multi-receptor organ, integrating input from vibrations, thermoreceptors, and pain receptors. This primal listening system is then amplified with vestibular and cochlear information as it becomes available. With responsive listening proven at 16 weeks, hearing is clearly a major information channel operating for about 24 weeks before birth. Quote continues. The structures for tasting are available at about 14 weeks gestational age, and experts believe that tasting begins at this time. Tests show that swallowing increases with sweet tastes and decreases with bitter and sour tastes. In the liquid womb space, a range of tastes are presented, including lactic, pyretic, and citric acids, creatinine, urea, amino acids, proteins, and salts. Tests made at birth reveal exquisite taste discrimination and definite preferences. Until recently, no serious consideration was given to the possibilities for olfaction in utero, since researchers assume smelling depends on air and breathing. However, the latest research has opened up a new world of possibilities. The nose develops between 11 and 15 weeks. Many chemical compounds can cross the placenta to join the amniotic fluid, providing the fetus with tastes and odors. The amniotic fluid surrounding the fetus bathes the oral, nasal, and pharyngeal cavities, and babies breathe it and swallow it, permitting direct access to receptors of several chemosensory systems. Taste buds in 3 locations, olfactory epithelia, that is membranes, vomeronasal, that is nose structure, system, and trigeminal, that is nerve system. Thus, prenatal experience with odorants from both sources, that is amniotic and placental, prepares this sensory system to search for certain odors or classes of odors. Quote continues, vision, probably our most predominant sense after birth, evolves steadily during gestation, but in ways which are difficult to study. However, full-term newborns have impressive visual resources, including acuity and contrast sensitivity, refraction and accommodation, spatial vision, binocular function, distance and depth perception, color vision, and sensitivity to flicker and motion patterns. In utero, eyelids remain closed until about the 26th week. However, the fetus is sensitive to light, responding to light with heart rate accelerations to projections of light on the abdomen. Finally, researchers have discovered that babies are dreaming as early as 23 weeks, gestational age, when rapid eye movement sleep is first observed, unquote, from the fetal census. If you close your eyelids and roll your eyes back and forth, the movement will cause sparks of light. This is perhaps the first light the embryo sees and may very well be the light source for our first prenatal dreams. The underlying logic of simultaneity's contribution to the self-identity of the embryo runs something like this. If I assume that different sensations, say taste and touch, occurring at the same time, originate at different locations on the body, say on the tongue and on the abdomen, then, since the body is present at both locations at the same time, the embryo has the opportunity to experience the sensations as 2 bodies, each present at a different location, and as well one body present at 2 different locations. The pull of the different sensations is toward duality and division, as each sensation is anchored to its own site or organ of origin. The counterpull of the simultaneity is toward unity and integration. One would expect then that in the course of embryonic development, as the number of different sensations increases, they will tend to loosen the unity. On the contrary, the more diverse the sensations felt at the same time, the more intense the impression of simultaneity, and hence the tighter the sense of unity. With the development of the cerebral cortex among humans, the balance definitely tips in favor of unity. My assumption in the above description is that the impression of simultaneity forms the nucleus of the imagination. Sensations felt by the embryo at the same time are, as I say, presumed to happen both where the simultaneity is imagined as well as in the different locations where the sensations actually occur. The Space, where the simultaneity is imagined, is dimensionless, since perception of space is a closed book to the embryonic imagination so long as vision is unavailable. Nevertheless, the unity of the organism is reinforced by making of actually different locations a virtual same place. Although scientists cannot at present provide an address in the brain where the space is located. This imagined space allows the organism to circumscribe and centralize the stress and strain of multiple growth in different locations, constantly challenging its unity. In this way, the impression of unity holds its own against the multiplicity of sensations and eventually overrides them without, however, effacing them. Without, that is, dissolving the one-many contrast between sensations simultaneously felt but diversely located. Another experiment, this time tactile, to demonstrate the power of the mind to produce the illusion of unity by means of simultaneity. Rest your forearm comfortably on a surface with your wrist facing upwards. Now with your other hand stretched just above your forearm, first lightly touch the crook of your elbow with the thumb of your outstretched hand. Then tap your wrist with the tip of your little finger of the same hand. Clearly, two different locations on your skin are being stimulated. Now, repeat the experiment, except this time tapping the two places on your arm at the same time. I venture to predict that you will be hard put to prevent the two stimuli from merging into a single sensation. True, the nerves in your forearm connect the 2 points of stimulation, but since the part of your forearm between the 2 points remains unstimulated, you might have expected the points of stimulation to remain separate and distinct from the rest of the arm. But no. The two locations appear to have merged into one. And the reason they have is because you have just experienced the power of mind to enforce the illusion of unity. In a manuscript entitled Arsi Versi, I describe how the power of the mind to enforce unity on disparate phenomena, a unity which I am assuming arises from experiencing different sensations simultaneously, plays out in creating the meaning of a sentence. Quote from Arsi Versi. Suppose I hire as many speakers as there are words in this sentence to stand before us, and having assigned 1 word apiece to each speaker in the order in which the words appear in the sentence, direct them at a given signal to utter loudly and clearly, all at the same time, all the words of the sentence. Chances are practically certain that the sudden din created by 58 people all speaking at once would be pure, unintelligible cacophony. If, however, the speakers render the sentence 1 word at a time and in order, then, if the writer has done his job, the sentence will be perfectly clear. Hence, the importance of sequencing words as part of the process of understanding what we read is obvious. Not so obvious, however, is the importance, as we read, of imagining a space in which the words coalesce into the idea which we call the meaning of the sentence. A space, moreover, in which the words are presumed to coexist simultaneously in much the same way that the numbers in a column of addition are presumed to coexist, although in an undifferentiated form, in the total, or as individual breaths coexist in an inflated balloon. Thus, just as, in order to understand what we read, we must sequence the words, so also we must synthesize or conflate them. That is, we must that is, activate and sustain the illusion as we read that we hear the words of the sentence as if they were spoken all at once. As if the words of the sentence were all rolled up into one word, which we call the meaning of the sentence. Moreover, the temporal sequencing of words involved in reading a sentence, a mutually excluding process in which one word drops from sight as the next word comes into view, contrasting as it does so strikingly with the mutually inclusive simultaneity involved in understanding the meaning of a sentence, produces in the reader's mind a sharp vibration between the one-at-a-timeness of sequence and the altogether-ness of simultaneity, which vibration accounts for the pleasure of reading. Another example from Who Owns the Planet Press, illustrating how the unity which I assume arises in the embryo from the simultaneity of sensations evolves into a powerful force that dominates the mind of the adult. Quote, as a result of being 13 pounds overweight, I popped a capillary in my head somewhere between the 45th and 50th push-up. 30 years earlier, when I was much heavier, I likewise popped a capillary, straining to accomplish the 20th push-up. As of yore, I at once became pleasantly lightheaded, and just the same as years ago, when I awoke the next morning, I experienced vertigo, which lasted about an hour and then disappeared. So I had every reason to diagnose my vertigo with confidence as the result of a burst capillary, which I like to think of as a mini-stroke, a cheap high caused by overstraining. Furthermore, it just so happened on the second occasion that at the very same time as I was experiencing vertigo, I also had diarrhea, cause unknown. Now, as I sat on the john spinning and shitting, I flashed on Kant's concept of apperceptive unity, realizing that by virtue of the power of my mind to unify experience, I had dismissed my diagnosis of mini-stroke, which I had been so sure of, as mistaken, and instead now believed that the vertigo, in combination with the diarrhea, was the single nauseating sensation which is customarily associated with coming down with the flu. So I could vividly appreciate how the mind indiscriminately unifies whatever phenomena, however discrepant, which simultaneously affect it, and unites the different components into a single experience. And isn't this the same power of mind previously described, which impels us to synthesize a sequence of disparate words called a sentence into intelligibility? For although we perceive the trail of words as a temporal succession, our power of synthesis, flinching out of control into unity, overwhelms us, with the result that we believe that we experience the passage of time required to process the words as a simultaneity, which we call the meaning of the sentence. And this imagined simultaneity is it not in fact an ideal virtual space in which words, in which physical symptoms, however diverse their origin, are dragooned into unity? Unquote. Two events randomly or coincidentally occurring at the same time are simultaneous. Two events intended to occur at the same time are synchronous. Simultaneity makes unity possible. Intention makes unity meaningful. When we intend something, we imagine that the moment when we intend it and the moment when the outcome occurs is the same moment presented in two installments. In the present, before the outcome occurs, when the simultaneity is imagined, and in the future, after the outcome occurs, when the simultaneity is realized. This delayed simultaneity, which takes the form of prediction and result, accords with the organism's natural tendency to unify, in this case, to unify the present and future by intending it. Let me illustrate how the psychic unity arising from simultaneity joins present and future into the single moment that underlies a synchronistic event. What are the odds against happening to sneeze just before I read a passage in which someone is described as sneezing? The odds against it, even if I have the flu, are astronomically high, if not infinite. But notice how vivid certain implications become if it does happen. Plutarch, Greek Lives, Themistocles, quote from Plutarch. While Themistocles was performing the sacrificial rites alongside the flagship, 3 extremely handsome prisoners of war were brought to him, arrayed in magnificent clothing and golden jewelry. Their parents were said to be Sandasi, who was the king's sister, and Artiocetes. Just as the diviner Euphrantides caught sight of them, a brilliant flame shot up high in the air from the entrails, and significantly, a sneeze was heard on the right, unquote. If I, the reader, sneeze a moment before I read the last sentence of the passage, then the unidentified Greek bystander who sneezes, the writer Plutarch who records the incident and thus provides me with the opportunity to be prescient, and I are somehow implicated in the same coincidence. What does that mean? When I hear myself sneeze, I am in my room reading. When a few seconds later I imagine, by reading about it, that I hear a Greek sailor sneeze, without a moment's hesitation, I entertain the notion that my sneeze and the Greek sailor's sneeze are somehow one and the same. And the reason that I feel that the two incidents, separated both by a few seconds and by centuries, are one and the same is because, seen in retrospect, I consider my sneeze as a prediction that I was about to read about someone who sneezes. Since my prediction proves correct, then, like any correct prediction and result, the boundary between present, the moment of prediction, and the future, the moment when the result proves the prediction true, is blurred. This is so because, to the extent that I see into the future must be present to me. That is, it must have doffed its invisibility and deigned to show itself privately to me before it displays itself publicly to everyone. Hence, it must have entered my time scheme to the same extent that I have entered its. The disappearance of the temporal boundary between correct prediction and result accounts for the fact that my sneeze and the Greek sailor's sneeze merge into a single sneeze. The upshot is that my sneeze did not occur randomly and without consequence. Rather, it occurred for a reason, namely, in order to predict that another was about to sneeze. I conclude then that it's my hunger for a reason that causes me to transmute the triviality of coincidence into the momentousness of synchronicity. But why must I crave a reason? Because if I correctly predict a result without realizing that that is what I am doing, and don't realize it until the result occurs, then the motive and hence the rationality of the prediction is not an attribute that I possess, but rather is one that, shall we say, the universe possesses, and that is expressed through me. But that implies that the universe is rational. Moreover, if the universe is rational, then it's very likely that it's alive, and hence I may be able to influence it to ensure my survival. In short, I regard my sneeze as significant because by doing so, the universe becomes rational. But if rational, then intentional, that is, capable of intending me to predict an event which I can't possibly foresee, and hence alive, and therefore I acquire a powerful ally to help me because I'm vulnerable and can die at any moment. Unquote. That's from Sermon on the Flats by myself, Press. Fanatical adherent of unity and order, in defiance of the inconclusiveness of nature, the human mind naturally inclines toward monomania. Self-awareness, by positing an observing self, witnessing itself as a locus of sensations, weakens the grip of unity on the mind by diverting the onrushing maniac flow of mental energy into two channels. Unity ensures identity, and obviously identity makes me identifiable. But why is it important to be identifiable? Quote from Sermon on the Flats. When humans first appeared on Earth, they were few and far between. Since food supplies and natural resources were plentiful, who you were and what you were doing there, so long as you were not obviously threatening, was not an issue. People simply rummaged through the environment for whatever they needed to survive. So long as supply exceeded demand, no one cared how much anyone took, since, like the air they breathed, the water they drank, and the wood they burned, there was plenty left. At some point, however, as population increased and food supply diminished, necessities became scarce. People cope with scarcity by investing labor in the cultivation of food and by limiting accessibility to natural resources. Communities claimed territories of their own and excluded other communities from exploiting reserves. Thus, ownership arose as a conservation measure to protect investment of labor and to limit access to scarce resources by excluding non-owners. Whose son or daughter, nephew or niece you were, came to determine whether you had access to necessities or not. Identity became a determinant of survival. I require identity, then, in order to be ranked in the world according to whether I have privileged, probational, or unauthorized access to natural resources. The parsimonious habit of thought, particularly bedeviling science, is to reduce the whole of whatever it's examining to the part it can lay its hands on, and then consider what it discovers about the part to be a discovery about the whole. Or, as one might put it, science takes the signature for the signer. In rhetorical studies, the same reductive tendency of speakers to abbreviate and tag reality is called synecdoche, a figure of speech that substitutes a part of concrete reality for the whole of it. Quote, "All hands on deck," the captain cried, unquote. Where the hands, the part, are attached to the sailors, the whole, but obey the will of the captain as if the hands were his own. So brain specialists, especially since the advent of left-right brain theory, tend to identify the person, the whole, with his or her brain, the part, as one might mistake the steering wheel turning this way and that of a remotely controlled car for the driver. The brain, however, does not think. A person thinks with his or her brain. But because the brain is more accessible as an object of science than the person, just as the finger I slip the wedding ring on is more accessible as an object of love than the woman I marry, science promotes the idea that the brain thinks, thereby depersonalizing the human by reducing him or her to a function of the brain, and thus encouraging the false belief that the tail wags the dog, instead of the dog wagging the tail, albeit in the case of us humans, we keep our tails tightly coiled under our hats. Neurologists claim, for example, that however incompatible with each other are the initial sensations presented by eye, ear, nose, tongue, and skin, the language peculiar to each is translated into the lingua franca of the senses, namely electrical nerve impulses. The impulse travels to the cortex where it is evaluated according to a set of time-honored rules for ensuring self-preservation, then returning to the sense of organ with the recommendation that the body wince with pain or purr with pleasure. But does the cerebral cortex see, hear, smell, taste, and touch the way I do? If it does, then it and I are the same person. But isn't it more likely that the cortex receives the raw sensation already electrically coded, and that it has no more of a feel for the original transmission as someone wearing gloves for the smoothness of silk? If so, then, the cortex is merely the instrument that coordinates the other instruments, and is no more to be identified with the instrumentalist than an oven with the baker. I understand that Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, had his revelation while sitting on the toilet. My first thought, which led to the discovery that mind begins as a simultaneity of diverse sensations, was, frankly, pornographic. Let me quote from my notes. Suppose while you're sucking my dick, I speculated, I feel a pang of hunger, and also I need to take a shit. Because my body is uniform, that is, because I have only one body, I feel three sensations at once. I am simultaneously aware of three quite different locations because I am present at each location. I am in three places at once. I loiter at my anus, I rummage through my stomach, and I feel welcome in your mouth. Let me try again, I thought to myself. I almost have it. I sit at my desk. I feel my ass in the chair, my feet on the floor, my hand on the desktop. I surmise that my awareness of the different locations of the same tactile sensation is a product of my feeling simultaneously the different locations of the sensation. For if I did not feel the different locations simultaneously, I would have an ass, a foot, a hand, but I wouldn't be aware that the possessor of them was the same person, namely me. That the simultaneity personifies itself as me. Furthermore, to generalize from different locations simultaneously felt of the same tactile sensation to sensations different in kind simultaneously felt, sight and hearing for instance, my consciousness of myself is essentially linked to the simultaneity of the sensations abstracted from different sensations. My body, then, is the place where different physical events, that is, different sensations, randomly overlap at one and the same time. but because they overlap at the same time in the same general location, namely my body, they appear significant. That is, they lead up to and signify me as the agent conscious of them. What follows are basic ideas regarding the notion of simultaneity, which I think are crucial to understanding the relation between the senses and the mind or soul. By abstracting the simultaneity of different overlapping sensations, the organism provides itself with an internal sense, John Locke's phrase, for dealing with the sensational content. The sensations of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch are each unique to a particular sense organ, and so are incompatible with and untranslatable into each other. However, the organism experiences the different sensations at one and the same time. The simultaneity of the diverse sensations makes it possible for the organism to experience them as a single event. Moreover, because things which happen at the same time share the same moment with each other, they give the impression of being timeless with regard to each other. The cessation of time translates subjectively, in the case of humans, into the illusion that I am possessed of a super sense organ called mind, capable of existing outside of time. In addition to timelessness, a second characteristic of simultaneity is that it imposes unity on events that happen at the same time by uniting them into a single occasion. This unity translates subjectively into the impression that any and all sensations I experience are mine. In other words, I experience diverse sensations as if I were simultaneity personified, whose mission in life is to convert to the gospel of unity all sense impressions whatsoever. This imagined inner space where time has ceased and where in the name of unity it appropriates all sensations as its own property is the place where, as Max Stirner writes, quote, even in the deepest reflection, one becomes, quote, thoughtless and speechless every moment. And let me give him the whole Max Stirner quote. Just observe yourself in the act of reflection right now, and you will find how you make progress only by becoming thoughtless and speechless every moment. You are not thoughtless and speechless merely in, say, sleep, but even in the deepest reflection, yes, precisely then, most so. And only by this thoughtlessness, this unrecognized freedom of thought, or freedom from thought, are you your own. Only from it do you arrive at putting language to use as your property. That's from Max Stirner's book, The Ego and His Own. If you wish to experience the power of mind to unify distinct sensations, run the tip of your finger lightly over your wrist. The tactile sensation appears to unite the surface of the fingertip with the surface of the wrist in a single sensation. The sensation on the fingertip we know from sliding it along the smooth surface of a ceramic plate or of a piece of wood is uniformly coarse, while the sensation on the wrist, brushed lightly with a feather, is rich and various, as a complex bouquet, as they say of the taste of wine. But the two sensations, although independently distinguishable, are inseparable so long as the finger is grazing the wrist, as inseparable as two musical tones sounding together at one and the same time from the chord they produce. The human embryo instinctively translates the impression of simultaneity of different sensations into a Euclidean point without length or breadth, which serves as its mind. Mind is necessary at this early stage of development as a headquarters to synchronize the explosive cellular growth proceeding in every direction. Quote from The Fetal Senses 12, not 5, a new proposal, birthpsychology.com. During most of the 20th century, scientists doubted the presence of functioning senses during fetal life. Touch was merely reflexive, hearing severely dampened, if not drowned, in the liquid environment of the womb. Vision was primitive at best, first blocked by closed eyelids and then distorted underwater. And the sense of smell was judged impossible without air. By the end of the century, however, experts were reaching for a consensus that there could be touch, hearing, and tasting in utero. Nevertheless, considering the immaturity of the brain in utero, skepticism remained about how any sensory information could be given real meaning. In 1988, I was in a small minority who found evidence for 5 senses operating meaningfully by birth, unquote. The postnatal infant's growing awareness of the autonomy of its body confirms its sense of unity. It does not create it. Even before its autonomy is confirmed in the world, its unity is imagined in utero to be a simultaneity of different sensations. The person who in maturity perceives him or herself as a me, differentiated from a you, begins as an imaginary I, abstracted from the senses. If the senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch were mutually exclusive so that we could only experience one sense at a time while we put the other senses on hold, we'd appear to ourselves to be 5 different people, with just enough closet space in our psyche to accommodate one person at a time. Breaking news. Did you hear that? My ear exclaims. I hear nothing, my eye answers. What I see, however, is this. Something is moving its lips while holding a piece of metal. When the lips stop moving, fire and smoke shoot out of the metal. What happened? Skin screams. Something has put a hole in me. I hear a bang, cries ear. I see smoke, repeats eye. I'm burning up, insists skin. We had better call headquarters to see if something has happened. All I, E-Y-E, all I can do is see. It can't hear on me. All ear can do is hear. Unlike I, it can't see on me. If I could hear as well as see, and ear could see as well as hear, then maybe they'd know I'm here. But I cannot hear and ear cannot see, so how do they know I'm me? Since eye and ear live in different parts of town, how do they stay in touch? If I knew that, I would know much. I translate sight and sound into words delivered by my tongue. Like the memory of yesterday's dinner, however, a lot is lost in translation. True, eyes don't need to explain to themselves what they see. They simply see it. Nor ears what they hear. They simply hear it. But if ears wish to know what eyes see, or eyes wish to know what ears hear, then there falls to my tongue, scrappily informed by hearsay and see-say, the formidable task of showing the blind ear, of telling the deaf eye what's going on. Simultaneity ensures perfect temporal equality between events because of two simultaneous events. However, they differ in impact. One event is not more simultaneous than the other. Even if the events happen miles apart, happen galaxies apart, if they happen at the same time, they enjoy equal status in a temporal landscape. In fact, I share the simultaneity of the present moment on an equal basis with infinite space, because the now is everywhere at once. The following quote is from Rudolf Carnap's Conversation with Einstein, a book called Concepts of Simultaneity. The Carnap quote is Concepts of Simultaneity is written by Max Yammer, Johns Hopkins University Press. Quote within quote. Yammer's quote begins and then the quote within quote. The relation between now and simultaneity has scarcely ever been discussed. A noteworthy exception is Eugen Fink's statement, quote, "The fundamental meaning of the now is that of a universal simultaneity. It contains the whole worldwide extent of the simultaneous," unquote. A statement that perhaps explains Einstein's worry that the experience of the now meant something special for man, essentially different from the past and the future, but that this important difference does not and cannot occur in physics because his theory of relativity denies the existence of a universal simultaneity. Again from Yammer. If we ask ourselves why is it that human beings have no direct and immediate perception of the simultaneity of spatially separated events, we answer it's because no human observer can be present at these events when they occur, unquote. In contrast to Max Yammer, I would argue that if we regard the sense organs as spatially separated, although attached to the same body, then we're simultaneously present at least 5 different locations. Quote from Ernst Kantorowicz, The King's Two Bodies. "For the eternitas of God was timeless. It was a static eternity, without motion and without past or future. It was, as Augustine called it, a now ever standing still, in Latin, nunc semper stans, or as Dante put it, the point at which all times are present," unquote from The King's Two Bodies. I believe that the nunc semper stans of Augustine is a hypostasization of the organism's sense of being simultaneous with itself. Consider, when I anticipate something, don't I anticipate being simultaneous with it? Or when I regret or fondly remember something, don't I remember being simultaneous with it? Finally, because I am simultaneous with myself without interruption, isn't that the underlying reason self-interest dominates all other interests? Therefore, isn't the real reason why I wish to do whatever it takes to preserve myself simply to stay high on simultaneity? Conversely, if I am so depressed that I lose faith in the power of simultaneity to get me off, don't I wish I was dead? Another quote from The King's Two Bodies by Ernst Kantorowicz. "For between the generic communitas or universitas of Bologna, on the one hand, and the individual and material community of Bologna composed of mutable citizens and perishable buildings, on the other hand, there arose a third entity different from both, an entity which was immaterial and invariable, though not devoid of individuation, which existed, as it were, in some perpetual time-space, and which appropriately might have been called bononitas or bolonity, that is, the juristic person or personified community of Bologna. Nevertheless, that corporate, if incorporeal bononitas, represented, like the angels, species and individuation at the same time. Unquote. The corporate, Kantorowicz is writing about medieval metaphysics, a relation between theology and politics. This is me. The corporate, if incorporeal, personified community described by Kantorowicz, which unites the generic idea of the community of Bologna with the material community of Bolognese citizens and buildings, pivots on the simultaneity of both, a notion which traces its origin to the organism's sense of being simultaneous with itself. The next quote is from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, critical of the extrovert point of view. Quote, "What a sight the difficult and envied labors of a European minister are for a Carib, a native of the Caribbean. How many cruel deaths would the indolent savage not prefer to the horror of such a life, which often is not even sweetened by the pleasure of doing good? But in order to see the goal of so many cares, the words power and reputation would have to have a meaning in his mind. He would have to learn that there is a kind of men who set some store by the consideration of the rest of the universe, and who know how to be happy and content with themselves on the testimony of others rather than on their own. Such is, in fact, the true cause of all these differences. The savage lives within himself, the sociable man always outside of himself, knows how to live only in the opinion of others, and it is, so to speak, from their judgment alone that he draws the sentiment of his own existence." Unquote. Okay, let's balance the prejudices. The introvert intuits that the self cannot be found nesting in the opinions of others. That's Rousseau's opinion. But the extrovert, that one's own opinion of oneself is an empty nest. I'm an introvert, so let me indicate what self-searching was like for me. Suppose I'm playing hide and seek. I'm it, but the person I'm seeking has found a perfect hiding place behind my eyes. That is, behind the eyes of the very person seeking him. I know where the person is hidden, but I can't squeeze my hand into the space behind my eyes to tag him and declare him found, because I myself, the seeker, am blocking the sentence. Ollie, ollie, entry. Child talk for all ye enter who have business with the court. I cry, admitting defeat. But the person won't come out, thinking it's a trick. He's like those Japanese soldiers who didn't emerge from the jungle until 20 years after the war was over because they heard that Americans loved Japanese food. The higher one rises in a social hierarchy, the more everyone below appears to be acting simultaneously because one takes in the entire spectacle at a single glance. That gives one the feeling of existing outside of time, of looking on from above. That's why the so-called lust for power fosters the illusion that one is safely outside of time and hence immune from its influence. Since, however, one is not outside of time, and the more one denies it, the more estranged from reality one is, I consider the ambition to rise to the top of a hierarchy a mania, masquerading as a marvel. And the next quote is from Isidore of Seville, an early medieval Latin writer. Above the staff which the Roman general carries in the triumphal march through the ancient city sat an eagle as an indication that they, the generals, approached heavenly supernal grandeur. To that end they were smeared with red color, as if they imitated the image of divine fire. Indeed, that they were touched by the executioner, Carnifex, was an indication that raised to such a great height, they should be mindful of their human inferiority, mediocritatis, from Isidore. If I'm interested in what happens on Earth, but at the same time believe it's inevitable that the Earth will run down until, unable to support life, it becomes a dead planet, what drives me to care about the fate of the Earth and the people on it, especially since soon enough I myself will be dead? Am I delirious? Indeed, I am delirious. And the reason I am is that being alive simultaneously with whatever else exists creates the illusion of timelessness between me and whatever else exists. Just like someone running beside a train which is slowly pulling out of the station creates the illusion that the runner and the person on the train watching through the window are motionless with respect to each other. Shared simultaneity, I maintain, is responsible for producing that existential, maybe even chemical, contact high that makes being alive seem like standing still at full speed. So you might just as well ask me why I feel good when I'm high on drugs as ask me why I interest myself in what happens on Earth. An interest, as I say, that overrides two excellent reasons not to bother myself with what happens, namely, that the Earth is destined to be a dead planet and that I will shortly be a dead man. I answer by saying that owing to the illusion of timelessness produced by my simultaneity with my present environment, I interest myself in the future of the planet because I am under the illusion that I am simultaneous with it. And here's a little postscript to that point. The excitement of combat in war, where the simultaneity of two soldiers on opposed sides is intended to terminate with the death of one of them, strikes me as an attempt to mix simultaneity with anxiety, like taking uppers and downers at the same time, in a kind of existential substance abuse. Furthermore, by the time surviving soldiers return to civilian life, the anxiety associated with sharing a life or death present with a sworn enemy persists out of deeply ingrained habit and infects the simultaneity shared with fellow countrymen and countrywomen who ought to be above suspicion of intending harm. This is the paranoia depression associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Surprisingly, with all our differences, the simultaneity of everyone existing at the same time unites us. The unity doesn't go very deep, but it does cover a lot of ground. In fact, it covers all the ground there is. There's time that registers change, time on the go, and time that registers simultaneity, stop time. If event A and event B are perceived at the same time by observer Y, A and B are simultaneous with each other. Thus, simultaneity is an idea in the mind of Y regarding the temporal relations between A and B. While some things are coming together, other things are falling apart, but both are occurring at the same time, I tentatively define the present moment, therefore, as the projection of the observer's simultaneity with things onto the things themselves. Being simultaneously present with the absence of things that once were but no longer are present, I call the past. Or if things that, although not present at the time, are about to be present, I call the future. Whether simultaneity itself is timeless or temporal, well, if it's the projection of the observer's simultaneity with things onto the things themselves, but the observer is perishable, then simultaneity is timeless for the time being. On the analogy of empty space, the transparency of which is conceivable only relative to the material objects which are added to or subtracted from it, so that by itself space remains a purely phantom phenomenon, so the imagination is itself conceivable only as a transparency relative to the images which are added to or subtracted from it. Extended and inner space are two transparencies, one inside the other, a world apart. Dream time is sequence without duration, because in order to know how long an event lasts, I must be able to compare it with another event which lasts a shorter or longer length of time. But dream events are incomparable because dream time represents time change without duration. Dream time corresponds with dream space, which is change of place without motion. So dream time and dream space may represent imagination originale, psychic unity before intention is added, which connects past, present, and future in real time and space. The following are miscellaneous, a trail of miscellaneous, I hope, insights. Simultaneity is stationary or stop time, that is, time in which all relative movement which time requires in order to pass has ceased. The word simultaneous, from the Latin simul, means at the same time, together, at once, as soon as. Cognate with Sanskrit sama, which means the same, and the Greek cognate is hama, the H sound substituting for the sibilant S sound, sama. Together is what the Greek means. If my identity is spectral and your identity is spectral, we can imagine two specters merging into one specter with two bodies. If we do, we say we are romantically inclined. Likewise, we can imagine 2 billion specters merging into one specter with 2 billion bodies. If we do, then the involvement of all of us with each other is telluric or planetary. Ear cannot imagine space. Eye cannot imagine time. Touch and taste cannot imagine distance. Smell cannot imagine contact. Somewhere, what each sense cannot imagine is imagined simultaneously. That simultaneity is me. This quote is from Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, and I found it in a book titled People of Paradox, by Michael Kamen. Quote, "The idea that I was two persons, that my identity was double, began to fascinate me with its simple solution of my experience." That's Julian West in a character in Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards. The two persons is the one who looks backwards and the one who looks forward. Unquote. Unlike Julian, I'm two, not as the result of looking backwards and forwards. I'm two because one me, my body, experiences sensations: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. Sensations so unlike each other that what needs to be explained is why I'm not five people instead of one, each located in a different country where a different language is spoken. But another me, my mind, experiences them as a coherent unity. The question is, what unites that initial incompatibility of the senses? The answer: the sensations are imagined to be one because they occur simultaneously. Simultaneity of time is imagined as simultaneity of place. That is, imagined as the same place, and the same place is imagined to be me. In 1981, when I first considered the question how the senses contribute to a unified personality, I drew the conclusion that given the incomparable diversity of the senses, the fact that I go about as a single body may have deluded me into believing that I'm one person and not a hodgepodge of irreconcilable sensations masquerading as a unity. At that time, I speculated that the senses united by means of a, quote, hedonistic calculus, unquote. Let me quote from the notes I took at the time. A theory of personality. We each have 5 dispositions: 5 fingers, 5 toes, 5 senses. If female, the 5 dispositions are 3 girls and 2 boys. If male, 3 boys and 2 girls. If gay, 2 boys, 2 girls, 1 tuba player. 5 characters, each differing from the other as sight from hearing, as smell from taste or touch. 5 candles, 1 wick. Mind is where the senses, unintelligible to each other, agree to keep house. How can senses agree or disagree with each other? In what language do eye and ear swap tales? How converse light and dark with loud and faint? Or sweet and sour with smooth and rough? Or with redolent and noisome? They communicate according to what irritates or gratifies. By means of a hedonistic calculus, the senses negotiate mind into being. The sound of the sharp blades slicing the onion pleases the ear. The smell, the exhalation of the onion, irritates eye and nose, but tongue is pleased. Skin, non-committal. Eye and nose, cabal. Likewise, tongue and ear. Skin holds the decisive vote, to slice or not to slice. Smells like trouble, nose admonishes. Honeysuckle has turned your nostril head, retorts tart tongue. But skin is its own person. What's onion skin, philosophizes, if not a silky geisha? Senses so unlike that only mind could love them. Language dispatches taxis down signless streets, past unnumbered houses. Years later, I detected in the notion that the senses negotiate mind into being an assumption that challenges the current scientific theory that the brain inducts the senses into a unified nervous system. According to current theory, upon being stimulated, the sense organ asks the brain whether the sensation it experiences feels good or bad, pleasurable or painful, whereupon the brain, submitting the question to an electrical think tank, decides whether the sense organ should encourage me, its host, to cry out in pain or sigh with pleasure. Thanks to the speed at which an electric impulse completes its circuit, all this, of course, happens in an instant. In short, the brain translates 5 unrelated languages into the lingua franca of nervous electrical energy. Bypassing the question altogether, what part, if any, the speakers of the languages play in creating the universal medium of communication? That is, what part the senses play, if any, at all, in forming the cerebral cortex? Or is it the cerebral cortex alone that unilaterally grants to the senses a license to experience sensations? The difficulty here is that brain and mind belong to 2 different realities. The one objective, the other subjective, which nevertheless overlap and combine into a single binocular reality. What I find interesting about these scattered early thoughts on the senses is that in rendering them subject to a hedonistic calculus, I had leveled out their differences, making of them pleasure seekers and pain avoiders. And since science has elected the brain the pleasure and pain capital of the body, I was attributing their unity to the brain. Now, on the contrary, I assume that in the early embryonic phases, the senses and the brain develop interactively. One might say that the senses indeliberately create the brain at the same time that the brain just as indeliberately translates simultaneity of sense activity into undifferentiated unity, which in turn overlooks their differences in an attempt to unite them. At the time, I hadn't yet reached that point in my thought, although I was moving toward it negatively by satirizing brain theory whenever it laid claim to being a theory of knowledge. For example, also in 1981, I wrote the Judas Lecture on the Human Brain, delivered at a meeting of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, Judas spelled capital D, J-E-W-D-H-A, the Judas Lecture. The lecture. The brain is the body's stockholder. It keeps a portfolio of sensations. Wetness, for example, is a sound investment, provided that the body doesn't get in over its head. Heat is a sound investment, but here the body must proceed with caution. Ice cream is generally safe. Since I happen to have my brain with me today, let me pause for a moment and put a question to it. How sound an investment is the brain itself? My brain answers as follows. Oh, good. Very good indeed. I'm highly enthusiastic. You can put all your eggs in that basket. The brain plumes itself on being a think tank. But here is the inside dope. The brain is in the electrical transformation business. It transforms electrical impulses into sensations. It thinks it has a monopoly on sensations, but does the heart have a monopoly on blood simply because it pumps it? Does the stomach have a monopoly on food simply because it digests it? Does the bladder have a monopoly on piss simply because it stores it? Nevertheless, unlike heart, stomach, and bladder, which perform their functions without knowing what they are doing, the brain is very well aware of its importance sensation-wise. How is this knowledge expressed? In ideas. Ideas are the scrap heap of sensations. Ideas are what's left over after electrical impulses have been received and sent on their way as sensations. Consequently, ideas are pure profit in the same way that scrap, which can be melted down and recycled, is pure profit. The question, of course, is of profit to whom? Anyway, how did a scrap heap get to be king of the mountain? Gentlemen, the sad fact is the brain has no more idea why it thinks than the heart has why it pumps. To the extent that the brain thinks it knows why it thinks, to that extent does it delude itself with visions of grandeur, the end result of which is the merciless exploitation of the organs of the body. Therefore, I propose that the Junior Chamber of Commerce go out on strike. Picket the brain. Halt the production of ideas. Let us turn our back on all ideas of anticipation and regret, joy and sorrow, love and hate, good and bad. Instead, let us bend our efforts toward providing ourselves with the necessities of life during half the year, and the rest of the year go on picnics. Furthermore, inasmuch as the brain is a speculator on sensations, let us boycott all fastidious ones, unless you prefer coq au vin to brotherhood, color TV to keeping in the pink, symphony, jazz, rock, or disco music to whistling while you work. I, for one, gentlemen, am tired of living in the hip pocket of my brain. Come, and once and for all, let us unite in brainless affection. I thank you. Unquote from Judah's speech. Notice that the Judah begs the question as to whether the sense organs produce the sensations which they simply deposit in the brain bank and receive them back as bank statements, or does the brain produce the sensations which are granted to the sense organs in the form of high-interest loans? In other words, who owns the sensations, the senses or the brain, the people or the Central Bureau of Population? In 1988, once again I took up the subject of how mind serves to control and integrate the diversity of the body. I took it up in the form of a parody of left-right brain theory. At the time, I was determined to dispel the trance current science had put me under with regard to that theory. Grippo, the Guru Hippo, discusses left-right brain theory and stupidity. On another occasion, someone asked Grippo, how does the brain work? Grippo wiggled one ear, then the other, and emerging from the pond, he gave the following reply. The brain is composed of dozens of tiny brains, each with a mind of its own. The leg brain wants to walk, the tongue brain wants to talk, the eye brain wants to gawk, the heart brain wants to knock, the jaw brain wants to lock, the cheek brain wants to mock, the fist brain wants to sock. And on the right side, the leg brain wants to trip, the tongue brain wants to sip, the eye brain wants to drip, the heart brain wants to skip, the jaw brain wants to rip, and cheek and ear and fist are out to lunch. However, at some point in the course of animal evolution, all the brains met together and formed a loose bicameral confederation called mind. Since that time, representatives have sat in continuous session, debating, passing, defeating, and shelving resolutions such as the following. A law to prohibit smoking proposed by the lungs but buried in the glands. An increase in salary granted to the hips. A recommendation to investigate the heart made by the blood to be carried out by veins. The swearing in of a carbuncle. A farewell banquet for a turd. A stubborn kneecap deadlocked with a shin. Bones swinging majorities, sinews cracking whips, boondoggling elbows, junketing ganglia, ankles caucusing with heels, thumbs up for re-election, genitals sulking in the vestibule. But does bicameral mean two brains or one? Here's what you ask. When you tear a match out of the matchbook, rub the match head against the scratch pad, and light a cigarette, are your left and right hands two machines functioning cooperatively or two parts of the same machine functioning diversely? I really don't know. But if you wish to prove that you have two brains instead of one, place your left hand under a stream of hot running water, your right hand under a stream of cold running water, and ask yourself why you do not experience the sensation of lukewarm running water, a sensation which you might have expected had you a single brain where hot and cold mix. But no, the sensations of hot and cold remain distinct. Therefore, you have two brains instead of one. Now, suppose you wish to prove the opposite, that you have one brain instead of two. Then argue this way. The sensation of wetness is the same in either hand, irrespective of the temperature of the water. Therefore, if you have two brains, the brains must be in agreement with respect to wetness. But if the brains are in agreement, that is tantamount to admitting that you have one brain instead of two. Consequently, whether you imagine you have one brain or two or 100 is a matter of convenience. I myself have chosen to imagine that I am unibrained on the odd days of the week and equibrained on the even. And since today is even, Grippo, another interrupted. My thoughts get in the way of my feelings. How can I get rid of my thoughts? This person, Grippo asked in turn, why do you wish to become stupid? If you stop thinking, which contrary to popular Zen opinion is quite easy to accomplish, you will overlook an obvious thought which all feelings call to mind, namely the thought of mutability. For mutability is to feeling as wetness is to water. Mutability is what all feelings have in common, just as wetness is what all sensations of hot and cold water have in common. And just as it is impossible to disassociate the sensation of wetness from water, so it is equally impossible to separate a sense of mutability from feeling. And whether you declare, grr, am I angry? Wow, am I surprised? Is that good? Or, ugh, is that awful? You can be certain you will not feel that way for very long. However, if you turn your back on thought in order to free your feelings, you will ignore what you already know about feelings, that they always change. And to ignore what you already know is to become stupid. Whereupon an attendant arriving with a fresh pot of jam, Grippo broke off speaking and withdrew into the mouth of a cave. What apes are saying. Sapiens are the simians, too stupid to survive without big brains. Argument for changing our name from sapient to fumus. They may think, they may laugh, but no animal smokes, only man. I assume that random sensations occurring simultaneously may be said to occur synchronistically, that is, to be significant or meaningful if the simultaneity is intentional. But how do I determine whether or not the simultaneity is intentional? Sensations triggered by random events that occur in the world outside my body are random sensations. So how does the random become intentional? To repeat what I wrote above, sensations coincidentally happening at the same time produce an impression of simultaneity on the organism, which triggers the creation of an imagined inner space or mind. Since simultaneity causes the mind to exist, but the mind is essentially a faculty for intending outcomes, the mind construes itself as an outcome intended by the sensations. It's a natural mistake for the mind to make, since it could just as well have judged itself to have been a random product of the senses, but a mistake which serves to increase its confidence in its own powers and hence to strengthen the organism's unity. The immediacy of my awareness of my body is unique to me and cannot be shared, just as the immediacy of your awareness of your body is unique to you and cannot be shared. Seeing, however, that I am aware that the immediacy of my awareness of my body is unshareable, just as you are aware that the immediacy of your awareness of your body is unshareable, nevertheless, how can we combine with any conviction that our shared awarenesses, that I am not you and you are not me, into an imagined we? How can I do that when what we share in common is paradoxically our awareness of the mutual exclusiveness of the immediate awareness of each of his or her natural body? The answer is that as much as we might want to share a mutually imagined body with the same immediacy with which each is aware of his or her natural body, we can't. The best we can do, if we are to respect the limits of our mutual awareness, but at the same time to infuse our mutual awareness of a shared imagined body with as much immediacy as possible, is to imagine what in fact is true, namely that we exist simultaneously. And moreover, to infuse our mutually imagined body with the immediacy of shared simultaneity of existence, as a real, if somewhat contrived imitation of the immediacy with which we are aware of our natural bodies. Of course, a society inspired by the simultaneous existence of its members would draw its inspiration from the present, not from the future nor from the past. Correspondingly, political power would shift from those who were here first to those who are here now, including those who were here first, but with their sense of priority inversely proportional to their increasing age. Ownership would loosen up to become the exclusive right to trespass. Also, investment would shift from buying up the future before it arrives to renovating the present before it disappears. Cultural expressions of simultaneity at the root of sempiternal personifications are described in The King's Two Bodies, a study in medieval political theology by Ernst Kantorowicz, Princeton University Press, first printed in 1957. I've already quoted from the book. Here are some more extensive quotations, and you'll begin to see how medieval legalists and theologians, without knowing the theory of mind-body being presented here, just indeliberately constructed concepts based on it. The quote: "The body politic of kinship appears as a likeness of the holy sprites and angels, because it represents, like the angels, the immutable within time. It has been raised to angelic heights, a fact which is worth being kept in mind." Quote continues, "The body politic is active in the individual king like a deus absconditus, like a deity hidden away." Indeed, hidden away. Now we know exactly how hidden. That was me, not Ernst. Quote continues, "Notwithstanding that these two bodies are at one time, that is simultaneously, conjoined together, the two bodies of the king, yet the capacity of the one does not confound that of the other, but they remain distinct capacities. In late antique art, we often find the halo bestowed on such figures as might impersonate a super-individual idea or general notion. This special mark of distinction indicates that the figure was meant to represent, in every respect, a continuum, something permanent and sempiternal beyond the contingencies of time and corruption. Roman provinces such as Egypt, Gaul, Spain, and others were sometimes represented with a halo, for example, in the late antique Notitia Dignitatum. In that case, we usually call these haloed females abstractions or personifications, which is correct as far as it goes, but we have to be aware that the most significant feature of all abstractions and personifications is their supra-temporal character, their continuity within time. In fact, it was not so much the personification which was made conspicuous by the halo as the genius, we say genius, Genius, of the individual province, that is, its perennial creative and seminal power, since genius derives from gignere, the Latin which means to reproduce. Much of what today we are inclined to associate with slogans such as Roma Aeterna or La France Éternelle was very precisely expressed by the Egyptus, the Gallia, the Hispania when adorned with the nimbus, the halo. The same was true with regard to notions of virtues. Justitia or Prudentia, who were goddesses in pagan antiquity, were meant to represent forces perpetually effective or forms of being perpetually valid when depicted in Christian art with the halo. In other words, whenever we capitalize a notion, and in the English language even change the gender from neuter to feminine, we actually are haloing the word or the notion and are indicating its sempiternity as an idea or power. Another quote from Kantorowicz. We may think, though, of other words than of marble is the stone, and putrid there he lies, as well when contemplating those tombs of powerful princes, spiritual and secular. Kantorowicz is describing here the tombs where a statue of the dead person is above, and below is the remains, the actual physical remains of the person. So the statue on top of the physical remains. For the decrepit and decaying body, natural in the tomb, now separated from the awe-inspiring body politic above it, appears like an illustration of the doctrine expounded over and over again by medieval jurists. Tenens dignitatem set corruptibilis, dignitatis tamen semper est non moritur. Quote, the incumbent of a dignity may decay. The dignity itself is nonetheless forever. It does not die. So the king's statue above represents the political king, the king who oversees parliament, who makes decrees. That doesn't die. That's a perk for government, that it continues. And that's the dignity. And the real king is the skeleton. The king is dead. Long live the king. Quote, our rapid digression of funerary ceremonials, effigies, and sepulchral monuments, though not directly related to the rites observed for English kings, has nevertheless yielded at least one new aspect of the problem of the two bodies: the human background. Never perhaps, except in those late Gothic centuries, was the Western mind so keenly conscious of the discrepancy between the transience of the flesh, focused on by, of course, Christianity, the Christian church, and the immortal splendor of a dignity which that flesh was supposed to represent, the office that the king represented, and of course eternality of the church. We understand how it could happen that the juristic distinctions, though developing quite independently and in a totally different thought compartment, eventually fell in with some very general sentiments, and that the jurists' imaginative fictions met with certain feelings which, in the age of the danse macabre, where all dignities danced with death, must have been peculiarly close to the surface. The king is immortal. You assassinate the king, however, the king bleeds to death. The two have never been closer, Kantorowicz says, than in the Middle Ages, because so close that the theologians in the church and the jurists working on laws and government theory are back to back. The jurists, as it were, discovered the immortality of the dignity, that is, the office, the government. But by this very discovery, they made the ephemeral nature of the mortal incumbent all the more tangible, the representative, the living representative. We should not forget that the uncanny juxtaposition of a decaying corpse and an immortal dignity, as displayed by the sepulchral monuments, or the sharp dichotomy of the lugubrious funeral train surrounding the corpse and the triumphant float of an effigy dummy wrapped in regalia, was fostered, after all, in the same ground, came from the same world of thought and sentiment, evolved in the same intellectual climate in which the juridical tenets concerning the king's two bodies achieved their final formulation. In both instances, there was a body mortal, God-made, and therefore subject to all the infirmities that come by nature or accident. That's Genesis, God created it. Set against another body, man-made, and therefore immortal. That is, the monarchy, the republic, is supposed to last forever, which is utterly void of infancy and old age and other defects and imbecilities. One king succeeds another eternally. In short, the quote continues, one revealed in strong contrasts of fictitious immortality, both immortalities fictitious, and man's genuine mortality, contrasts which the Renaissance, through its insatiable desire to immortalize the individual, which manifests in the 17th century by the individuation of property, thanks to, among others, John Locke. That's me, not Kantorowicz, in case I'm wrong. I don't think so. Through its insatiable desire to immortalize the individual by any contrivable tour de force, not only failed to mitigate, but rather intensified. There was a reverse side to the proud reconquest of terrestrial Ivum, eternity on earth. At the same time, however, immortality, the decisive mark of divinity, but vulgarized by the artifice of countless fictions, like the state, was about to lose its absolute or even imaginary values. That is, the divinity was. God was about to lose it just because of the close contrast, a comparison with the man-made artifices. Unless it manifests itself incessantly through new mortal incarnations, it practically ceased to be immortality, God's immortality. The king could not die, was not allowed to die, lest scores of fictions of immortality were to break down. And while kings died, they were granted the comfort of being told that at least as king, they never died. The title outlives the person who holds the title. Bureaucracy? Sound familiar? The jurists themselves, who had done so much to build up the myths of fictitious and immortal personalities, rationalized the weakness of their creatures, and while elaborating their surgical distinctions between the immortal dignity, the office, and the mortal incumbent, and talking about two different bodies, they had to admit that their personified immortal dignity was unable to act, to work, to will, or to decide without the debility of mortal men who bore the dignity and yet would return to dust. Here are problems for the student of Renaissance history as to how the subjects are presented. Nevertheless, since life becomes transparent only against the background of death, and death against the background of life, that's the proximity he was talking about, medieval times, they've never been closer. It's pretty far away from now, particularly with technology, and machines have a function of, are they alive or are they dead, blah, blah. Against the background of life, nevertheless, since life becomes transparent only against the background of death, and death against the background of life, the bone-rattling vitality of the late Middle Ages appears not devoid of some deeper wisdom. What one did was to build up a philosophy according to which a fictitious immortality became transparent through a real mortal man as its temporary incarnation, while mortal man became transparent through the new fictitious immortality, which, being man-made as immortality always is, which being man-made, as immortality always is, was neither that of life eternal in another world, nor that of the Godhead, but that of a very terrestrial political institution, unquote, the state. Thanks to Kantorowicz, we understand why we can't hold a position in any institution unless we believe that the office, epitomized by the title, upholds the dignity of the officer, not the officer, the dignity of the office. The hard lesson that every brilliant novitiate learns as they begin ascending the hierarchy. I am the ongoing fiction which my living body imagines, experiences its sensations. When life leaves my body, I evaporate. If life, as it were, is the sun, then you might say, I am the shadow my body casts inwardly. The person, the fiction generated by the body, is invisible, inaudible, impalpable, scentless, tasteless, unable to be perceived by the senses. It seeks witnesses to confirm its reality. The false testimony of other persons, equally as shadowy. Since Rabbi Crossbones has been accused of frittering away his time here on earth without being of use to anyone, he has decided to start a dating service called Rabbi Crossbones Dating Service. Here is his free offer to meet and go on a blind date with yourself. First, close your eyes, then swivel your eyeballs. Those sparks you see are caused by motor nerve synapses activating the muscles required to swivel your eyeballs. Now, if you ask yourself who the person is situated behind your eyes, observing the sparks, the answer is, that's you. Say hi. Just a minute, Rabbi. If that's me, what do I look like? How would I recognize myself in a crowd? True, you're in the dark. So isn't everyone. It's my opinion that everyone begins as the same person, sort of like a representative of the species with its genetic material still half asleep, and undergoes modification depending on how the person reacts to what it sees over the years, peering through those eyes it has at its disposal. Moreover, the reason there are communists is because they believe it's the same person looking through 7 billion different sets of eyes. And the reason there are capitalists is because they believe it's 7 billion different people who are looking through the same genetic model of eyewear, custom tinted. The capitalists argue that it's the difference between folks that keeps the pot boiling. The communists, that it's the similarity that keeps the pot from boiling over. Well, we had 10 million years to decide the issue. Now, with abrupt, irreversible climate change, our time is up. It was getting boring anyway. After I'm dead, as far as I know, my life won't have mattered. So why does it matter now? Because matter that matters now is living matter. And living matter lives to matter now. The one thing I can be sure of about an infinite universe, Possible to name, yes, but impossible for infinity it's in its entirety to be conceived by mere n+1 creatures like me, is that, countless in number as the objects in space may be, everything in infinite space is present at the same time. Simultaneity is a kind of multineity, is thinkable, whereas spatial infinity is not. The reason it's thinkable is because the concept of simultaneity suspends the passage of time between even an infinite number of objects existing at the same time, allowing the objects to be conceived as an atemporal unity. Questions of sooner or later, prior or subsequent, being irrelevant, since everything exists in the moment, in the now. On the other hand, for spatial infinity to be conceivable as a unity, space in its entirety would have to be stacked up in one spot, which is absurd, since space would exist all around the stack. The next is a quote dealing from a book whose title is Suddenness on the Moment of Aesthetic Appearance by Karl-Heinz Bohrer, translated by Ruth Crowley, Columbia University Press, 1994, and it's a translation of Plötzlichkeit, Surkamp Verlag. Quote, "The modern writer, to the extent that he is not shielded by his worldview, that is, occupied with ideology, has already left behind traditional models for understanding reality. Hofmannsthal's moment is one of the first proofs for this negative, theory-free vulnerability of the reflecting modern artist who has broken out of traditional certainties. The epiphany of the moment is the only thing of substance remaining to such a writer. All ideologies, concepts fall away, just the moment is left. It cannot be interpreted symbolically and does not point beyond itself, but instead it calls into question every sort of anticipated continuity. Every sort of anticipated continuity is the heavy here, against which is the heroic, isolated moment." That's what Bohrer is talking about. Years ago, when I read him, the German philosopher Kant convinced me that all we know of reality is what our senses report. That's why I was annoyed while I was sitting in the backyard that the sound of water burbling from the fountain seemed to be coming from the fountain and not from my ears. Clearly, experience was contradicting Kant by inducing me to believe that whenever I heard the sound of water burbling from a fountain, but my ears stayed dry, the sound was not in my ears, but as Kant would have it, but in the fountain. I hate when life plays me for a patsy, so in order to return the sound of the water to its rightful source, I overrode my tactile sense, which swore my ears were dry, and imagined that I was a fountain and that the water I heard was indeed pouring out of my ears. Thanks to the assistance of my corrective imagination, at once the illusion disappeared that the sound of the water arose from the fountain and not from my ears. In the meantime, night had fallen, and the decorative lights wrapped around the branches of the ficus tree, which stood across the yard from where I was sitting, turned on and began to glow. Here was a new cause for annoyance. I knew that I was aware that the lights had come on because their illumination played across the lenses of my eyes. But how to replay the sensation so that I dispel the illusion that the illumination originated with the lights and not with my eyes? Earlier, I had returned the source of the sound of the water to my ears by imagining I was a fountain. I could trick my ears with a visual image because audition has no discrimination when it comes to visuals. But I didn't see how I could trick myself into reimagining that the sight of the illumination originated in my eyes and not in the lights, when my eyes, the authority on visuals, were convinced of the opposite. Resorting to the only strategy I could think of, I allowed my eyes to go out of focus and viewed the lights through each eye independently of the other until their binocularity became undone. What happened next was quite surprising. If previously in the auditory experiment, the source of the sound of the water had traveled, so to speak, from the fountain to my ears, now, by virtue of having relaxed their binocularity, my eyes appeared to stretch across the yard right up to the lights, leaving me behind at the other end of a dark visual tunnel. Apparently, if the lights wouldn't come to my eyes would go to the lights, until the lights were pasted on the lens of my eyes, proving, as Kant insists, that once we dispel the illusions that have become second nature in our arsenal of survival, all we know of reality is what our senses report. Because I remain self-identical throughout the large-scale changes my body undergoes over the years, owing to growth and decay, even when my body begins to die, I cling to my conviction that I am detachable from it, as a numerical sum is detachable from the column of figures that add up to it. I am Simultaneo Man. By feeling simultaneously the diverse sensations of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, and by responding to that simultaneity as if it were a spectral sense organ, whose function it is to integrate the other sense organs and e pluribus unum, endow them with a singular identity, my body imagines that it has a self. Imagines that it is me. I wonder, however, whether I am real or merely a figment of my body's imagination. To assure myself that I am real, I seek the confirmation of selves imagined by other bodies. But other selves are seeking the same confirmation as I am, that they are real and not just imagined. In this manner, our bodies, under the guise of being personable, associate and form societies. We are all simultaneoites, seeking confirmation that we are real. As Hegel and Marx feared to admit lest they be stigmatized as unscientific, society may very well be a person, at present no more than a scarecrow, that is, an effigy of itself, whose self-awareness manifests by fits and starts in the inexplicable coincidences and synchronicities that befall individuals. To put it naively, if we can arrange living conditions so that everyone feels comfortable enough not to expect the worst from each other, reading each other's minds may make communication as we know it obsolete. So when we experience synchronicities, it's society who is having the synchronicities, but it's still fragmentary, and so we think it's our synchronicities when it's. If only we could get ourselves together to receive it as it deserves. The instinct to survive literally means the instinct to outlive. Since it's impossible to outlive myself, it must mean the instinct to outlive the people around me. But if I love the people around me, why should I want to outlive them? Marv, what makes it instinctive is the urgency on the part of nature to camouflage the contradiction that by preserving its life at all costs, the organism is maneuvered into surviving the people it would never dream of surviving, because they are what make life worth living. Certainly taking life is ruthless, but preserving life can also rank high in ruthlessness. And to what end? That the planet might hoard up as much life as possible in the hope of outlasting any unforeseen interruption of living conditions. When I finally thought it through, I wished I hadn't even begun thinking about it. As I had feared all along without knowing why, the truth was a Medusa head in mothballs that activates upon being seen. You don't just look at the truth. The truth looks back at you with a look so uncanny that the only way to catch its meaning is to turn to stone. Currently, it's a toss-up whether to consider everyone half-baked or previously frozen. Wild truth and cultivated truth. Wild truth is premised on the infinite, cultivated truth on the finite. Simultaneity is what they share, as if the eternal and ephemeral require the simultaneity inherent in the moment to cohere. As if for the eternal and ephemeral to mesh, it's necessary for reality always to be suddenly caught off guard in mid-stride, remembering it forgot its hat. I'm pleased that the problem of the participation of the eternal and ephemeral in Plato's Parmenides, the dialogue, finds its solution in the concept of simultaneity, a concept which puts time on hold indefinitely. Anesthetic, the word, Greek, anesthetos, means insensible, from the Greek verb aisthanomai, itself derived from aio, to perceive. Latin, audio, audition, to hear. Oris, ear. Sanskrit root a, plus the digamma, v, that sounds like y, sounds like v. Avami, means, the Sanskrit means to care for, to watch over, to protect, to love. In Greek, the cognate is aetos, eagle. The irony that mind should function as an anesthetic to mute the stressfulness of bodily change, and is not, as science brags, the doctor in charge. If I define the present moment as being simultaneous with itself, with respect to itself, It's timeless. And yet, if I admit that it passes with time, I must explain without contradiction how a timeless moment disappears with the passage of time. Zeno, the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno, argues below in an analogous fashion about space, that since an object occupies a space equal to itself, with regard to itself, it's motionless. Zeno doesn't say so because it's not relevant to his argument, but if an object occupies a space equal to itself, it's also simultaneous with itself. Okay, Zeno's argument from Concepts of Simultaneity by Yammer. Zeno's third argument, known as the arrow, claimed that motion is impossible because, as Aristotle phrased it, everything is either at rest or in motion, but nothing is in motion when it occupies a space equal to itself. And what is in flight is always at a given instant occupying a space equal to itself. Hence, the flying arrow is motionless. And Yama comments, an equivalent but more elegant formulation was given by Diogenes Laertius in the 3rd century AD. Quote from Diogenes, "That which moves, moves neither in the place in which it is, nor in the place in which it is not." The same paradox. And my response is, if I'm watching a film in which someone shoots an arrow, since the movie screen remains motionless, I can argue that the motion of the arrow is impossible. Growth and decay on the outside, time standing still on the inside, ceaseless change and unchanging point of view. What do I infer from that? That materiality and mentality are correlative. That the only way I am conscious of exterior change is in contrast to interior timelessness. Simultaneo man is everywhere at once. He's everyone at once. He's an ounce of once, spread thinly through everything. When events happen at the same time, with respect to time, they are the same event, as would two objects be the same object if they occupied the same space. I define the present as being simultaneous with itself and also with me, as distinct from the future, which I anticipate will be simultaneous with itself and also with me, but as yet is not, and from the past, which I recall was simultaneous with itself and also with me, but no longer is. Yes, how to break the news to mankind that the only motive anyone could have had to expose it to the unbearable loneliness of being, a loneliness which drives us into each other's arms for consolation, was an uncontrollable impulse to thrash about in space in a futile attempt to escape that very same unbearable loneliness. God, we forgive you. Had we been in your place, we would have done the same thing. And probably would have neglected to make amends by shooting us up with life to drive us wild. Newton says, God is everywhere, created minds are somewhere, now we know where, and body is in the space it occupies. I comment, if for God I substitute infinity, then Isaac is speaking my language. Infinity is a bus which, no matter how fast you run to catch it, you never will, because you're already on it. I have the choice of asking myself, who am I? Or, who are you? If I ask, who am I? I'm aware I could have asked, who are you? But I've chosen to talk to myself as if I were the same person, rather than as if I were a different person. What surprises me here is that I must entertain at one and the same time that I am the same as myself and different from myself in order to choose between them. I fear I've fallen under the spell of my brain, which instinctively programmed to unite everything under the sun, including the questions, who am I and who are you, require me to push back to maintain my sanity whenever the contents contradict each other. And the contradiction always hinges on the impossibility that two things can't both be true at the same time. Do you get it? At the same time. Everything is drawn into the vortex of the simultaneity of the moment, where the tighter the unity, the more explosive the contradictions. And here's the Edgar Allan Poe-like upshot. The more desperately I feel I am at my wit's end, the more at one I am with myself. Good job, brain. Nice work, Simultanea. Now I understand why I feel in general that the more systematically I describe reality, the more reality vanishes into a clear blue sky of contradictions. If mind is the hallucination that anesthetizes endless becoming, being aware that it is no help. For on the pretext of escaping the hallucination by perceiving it from without, I only produce a hallucinatory ripple effect. In contrast to physical space, where the rule is that two objects cannot occupy the same location in space at the same time without being the same object, the analogous rule for temporal inner space is that two events cannot occur at the same time without being different events. I am an organic robot. Unlike mechanical robots, we organic robots grow wild. We take ourselves personally. We form communities, which we personify in turn as the social body of an invisible giant robot whom we dress in customs and habits according to our notion of what is fashionable, depending on where in general we think we are and what attire is appropriate to wear there. But since we can't agree on where we are or what attire is appropriate, because all we have to go on is that we're on a planet going around the sun, we break up into communities, that is, opposed factions within the world community. The communities contest with each other for ownership of the planet until by elimination only one community is left, the winning community, which appropriates the planet as its prize. In the meantime, we dress any way we like, so long as the attire is appropriate for spending all our days and nights as wild robots. The body produces the hologram of a human. That's the you feel inside you, which in vain seeks the confirmation of other holograms that it's as real as the body that made it. That's why people who haven't heard the news network for all they're worth, for all the good it does, to feel more real by being confirmed by a host of phantoms. The fact that space is infinite makes it unique, because since it occupies all the space there is, there's no room for a second infinite space. In addition to simultaneity, then, uniqueness is another quality the finite and infinite share. The finites are unique, one at a time, the infinite altogether. My awareness of myself is unique, since no other can be aware of me from head to toe, so to speak, and inside out, like I can. I assume, moreover, that your awareness of yourself, like mine, of myself, is likewise unique. So, in each other's company, two persons, each isolated from the other by their bodies, are simultaneously aware of each other. Our shared presence creates the illusion of timelessness, a quality which is inherent in simultaneity. This distraction from the mutability of our bodies comes as a great relief. We are solaced for our solitary confinement in our bodies. Time doesn't pass. We pass through time. Time stands still. The time it takes to pass through time, we call lifetime.